Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the Azure Cost Management and FinOps podcast hosted by Turbo360. My name's Mike Stevenson. Today, I'm joined by my good friend Rik Hepworth. Rik works for Black Marble, who are a Microsoft consultancy partner in the UK. Rik's one of the most experienced Azure people I know. I know Rik has a gold mine of great stories about everything to do with Azure, and I'm really glad that he offered to come and have a chat to us about cost management. So today we're going to have a bit of a chat about Rik's experience in cost scenarios with customers. Rik, would you like to just tell people a little bit about yourself, and thank you for joining us on the podcast?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So yes, I work for a company called Black Marble. I'm Chief Consulting Officer, which is a wonderful job title, right? It basically means I herd cats for a living. All of our developers, all of our consultants, they all work for me. And as a dev, Mike, you know how hard you are to manage, right? Like Mike, I'm an MVP and I'm also a regional director, which is another community award. So I'm quite passionate about sharing what I learn with the community. If you don't mind, Mike, a quick plug. I'm also one of the organizers of Global Azure. 3 glorious days of events focused on Azure, April 18th to 20th, 2024. And I'm proud to say that in the past, Covi have been sponsors as well. So we love them for that. But yes, that's me. Oh, and I don't shut up. So yeah.
So where do people go, Rik, if they want to learn more about Bootcamp?
Globalazure.net. We have a how-to if you're interested in running an event. Put a pin on the map. We don't mind what kind of event. It could be a cloud event focused on AI. It could be a developer event. It could be a get kids into coding. All we ask is that it's associated with Azure, right? You're talking about cloud, you're talking about Azure in some way or other, and it's between the 18th and 20th, anywhere on the planet. Last year we had 108 events were organized by about 106 communities. Which
cool,
is great. It's really cool. Yes, but we're not here to talk about Global Azure. We're here to talk about
cost and FinOps and stuff. So, Rik, so you've been a consultant for years. You've been doing Azure for as long as I've known you, pretty much. I think. Tell me what your thoughts are on customer experiences of cost management projects you've been involved in. What are the challenges? What works well?
I think my first thought is it's not quite as bad as it used to be, but I think it's still challenging for organizations for lots of reasons, right? So I tend to work with, if you like, the S and the M of the SME triad. I don't do much work for the Shells and Exxons of this world, but I do a lot of work for local government, public sector, smaller organizations, that kind of stuff. And what you often find with that is they tend to be slightly further back on that maturity model kind of curve, right? Yeah. So they've got a lot of really great talent and experience around on-prem. So, you and I both come from integration, so there's a lot of people who are used to running Windows servers and SQL servers and BizTalk servers and all that kind of stuff. And when they come to the cloud, they bring some of the experience with them, but they also bring a certain thought model. And when you've got tin on-prem, you want to sweat that asset. I always joke that I pay water rates, right? So technically, if I leave the tap running, my per unit cost of water is going down on average. But if I'm billed on a water meter and I leave the tap on, that's going to get expensive real quick. So those organizations tend to move into the cloud with the mindset of, we don't know how big this will be, therefore we'll give ourselves a lot of headroom. And then suddenly discover that the operating cost of the cloud is a lot higher than they thought it was going to be. And it's draining the budget from their migration. And then they start to struggle because the cloud project is not delivering the value they thought it was, because they thought cloud was going to be cheaper. And it can be, but where people tend to trip up is they don't look. They don't pay attention to what their costs are. They don't pay attention to have we got too big an app service hosting plan because we've got 16 gig of memory and we're only using one. could we turn it down? They don't think necessarily about turning things off when they're not using them, because devs like convenience, right? I don't want to have to turn everything on at 9 a.m. It's just there and running, and there are lots of things that can combine. And what's tended to be the problem with Azure particularly, organizations purchase Azure in lots of different ways, and even within the org, they purchase bits of it from one cloud solution provider, or other bits of it from an enterprise agreement, or there's always something on a credit card. And there's no, or there didn't used to be, a single view of all of those sort of billing islands to give you a unified view of where your costs were. And it wasn't always that easy to use, right? And you couldn't work out where your resources were in relation to who was paying for them. You know, if I'm the IT department and I'm doing work for you, Mike, and you're HR, I want to give you a monthly cross-charge bill. But that means I need to be able to work out how much I'm actually racking up in Azure costs for your solutions. And there are lots of great ways you can do that in the cloud. But because we never needed to do it on-prem, there's a lack of knowledge and understanding there. And most of the things that I end up trying to sort out for people is a lot of it's education. The customers are perfectly capable of doing it, right? They've got, if you like, the overall knowledge. What they lack is those specific skills to say, how do I find this information? How do I manage it? How do I discover before I've racked up a $4,000 accidental bill in 2 days that something might begin awry? Because I think that.
Do you think, with what you were saying before this, that's like a sort of CapEx, Opex sort of challenge, isn't it? Some of that. So I guess previously the HR department came along with a capital funded project to deliver something with on-premise VMs. Nowadays they come along with a capital funded project, but the Opex cost long term for that solution is much bigger than it would have been previously, and obviously that brings up that chargeback model. So how do you think organizations have changed to handle that? Do you feel they have changed in a way that's effective to handle it? Do you see cross-charging being something companies are doing very much or effectively, or is it specific to certain companies? And I know there was about 10 questions in there, so feel free to cover on.
The honest answer, Mike, is a lot of organizations are struggling to change to cope with it. So even over the past few weeks, if I had £1 for every IT department were saying, oh, our finance department are really struggling with this shift to needing to budget for things on a monthly basis, or even more granular than that, because again, in the olden days, we would buy a finance system and we'd expect it to have a 5 to 10 year life cycle, and tendering would be a 12-month process, and implementation would be a couple of years, and everything was very elongated. And purchasing departments have got a certain way of doing things, and the finance departments have got a certain way of doing things. It's kind of interesting, because I always used to joke that IT was often the anchor, right? Because IT doesn't like change, because change brings risk, and risk means things break, and we get beaten up because the service is down and the business isn't working. But over the past, certainly 10 years, but if you say the past 5 years, there's been a real change that we're all agile now, because the business environment we're operating in is much more fleet of foot. So IT's pivoted that we're all about agile and shortest time to deliver value. But the problem is that the purchasing departments and the finance departments are still being dragged forwards. And now they're struggling. So again, some of my time is sat in rooms where I'm trying to explain to the purchasing department that, well, yeah, you might be able to pay up front for this cloud thing, but actually that doesn't deliver you value, because we're going to overestimate again. And this isn't a, oh, well, I pay you so much and then we work it out and you give me money back kind of situation, right? So businesses have to be able to join the dots much more quickly and much more accurately between their costs and their revenues and their business activities and the things they do within the organization to support them.
So that sounds like we're kind of agile about delivering software and infrastructure, but we're not agile about kind of paying for it and managing the finance aspects of it.
Yeah, I think I have quite a few friends that do work for those big organizations, and the ones that are successful have looked at this thing FinOps. They've looked at how they achieve that visibility of what something costs, such that they can based on the information they can make decisions. But also what they've done is they tend to push the responsibility for that onto the team that's building it. It's that sort of you build it, you run it adage, that by giving the development team who are creating an internal application responsibility for the operating costs of that application sharpens their minds, and it's a lot easier to have lots of groups of people who are closely focused on the development and operation and management of a product, each of whom is watching quite closely, than having somebody up here, right, that's trying to watch all of them. Because it gets a lot harder as you get more information. And again, I think the organizations that are successful are the ones that have managed to, if you like, devolve, push down to closer to the metal, that monitoring of cost and immediately doing something about it. And the ones that are struggling are the ones that are still that sort of old legacy approach of, there's a finance director up here and he gets a quarterly report or a 6-monthly report, and the lag in that is too long. We can rack a really expensive bill in 6 months.
Yeah. What's your thoughts then with that around? So that traditional model of a project delivers a solution in an agile fashion, but then hands it over to a production team where it effectively the project probably ends and some support manager takes that over. Do you think that model kind of makes cost management challenging because the person who takes over the long run and support wasn't the person who actually delivered the project in the first place? Do you think that's still quite common?
I need to answer that a little carefully, because the nature of my business is we tend to do development and hand over the operating of what we've built to the customer, right?
But that can be involving the customer more in from day one. You know, if that support person, you know, to me, if like in the past, I saw a lot of projects where there was a very definitive line. We go live, then it transitions, but actually bringing the long-term owner of the application earlier into the life cycle, so they care about the costs during the sort of early stage of the project when you can do something about it, means that they become a stakeholder in a different way, rather than kind of saying, oh, I've been given this and there's not much I can do about it now. And
I agree entirely on that one. I mean, the best thing that we've done as an industry is improve how we communicate, right? And involving the people who are going to operating it and ensuring that they understand A, how things work, but B, that they are empowered to make changes to things. You know, it's that, yes, you can turn it down or up or whatever. And I think the one thing that we've learned as a developer is it's increasingly important for us when we write software for our customers to build in the appropriate amount of telemetry that the customer can see what's going on to be able to make decisions. And I think billing telemetry is just another aspect, right? In the olden days, it used to be, well, is it CPU load or is it IO load or is it, you know, disk or memory or whatever? Now it's, well, what is the cost? If I look at usage, is usage increasing in line with cost, or have I got something that again, you know, does cost outstrip the use, and why? And then we go and have a look. In a perfect world, again, back when we started doing integration in Azure, right? Logic Apps was consumption, and I have this wonderful customer story where I had a customer that spent £1 million a year on MuleSoft, and we migrated them to Azure, and their monthly spend ended up being £7,500 a month. And we did the math. It basically worked out maybe 111 years of Azure would be 1 year of MuleSoft. And the big difference was MuleSoft was an annual. This is not to put down MuleSoft, by the way. It's not a bad integration product. It was the funding model was we paid £1 million a year for the license. So the more we use it on-prem, the better, right? But in Azure, we paid for each transaction. And the customer really liked that because actually each transaction was very specifically linked to a business activity. An order came in, we had an integration, and we could see the explicit cost of one execution of that integration. And they could say, brilliant. Well, that means that every time we get an order, it costs us 10 pence.
Yeah.
1,000 orders is 1,000 times 10 pence, but each order brings with it revenue. So we don't mind that the bill goes up because it's going up proportionate to the amount of orders we're getting. Where it goes wrong is if the system is scaling and outstripping the revenue that's coming in from the business activity that we've automated. And that can often happen because the development team haven't really paid attention to how much it costs to operate what they're building relative to their understanding of the business domain. Which again brings us back to communication, right? What is this thing the business wants us to do? How much revenue does it generate? How much cost can it stand? How do we as a development team identify and surface those costs?
Sorry, Rik, I'm just making a note. You've made me think of a really good question.
Quick change.
Right, so I've got two questions. I don't want to forget them. So with what you've said there, which I find it's a really great way of thinking about it now. So I know my order costs 10 pence per order.
Mm-hmm.
How effectively do you think a customer understands the value of that order? I mean, obviously it may vary by in terms of the cost of it, like the value of an order might be £10 or £1,000, so each one might be different, but I guess they could average that out to work out the difference of the cost versus the value. But do you feel that customers have quite a good handle on the value of it, say an integration in this case, or possibly an application?
So in that particular example, the customer was absolutely aware because they were very focused on the costs in the business. And again, I think that comes back to what is the organization, and what does the organization do for a living? There's a very different outlook from let's say an online retailer, right, where there's absolutely a link between the electronic order and money coming in and then stuff happening, and maybe I don't know, a council whose job it is to basically provide services for us as residents, right? There might be costs of transactions for them in, I don't know, if I want to book a refuse pickup because I've got a sofa in the backyard, right? There are tangible costs in that, but they may be a lot more difficult for them to identify and align. So the automation I've just built, where you can go to a website and say, I'd like this sofa picked up and here's my address, please. It's kind of harder to correlate the value.
Yeah. So I guess there you've got different ones where it might be a per order, but I guess you could have an application where it might be a website and you can estimate a value per hour or something like that and correlate that to cost per hour through your Azure build. The second question I had was about, so in projects that you work on, do you ever come across, obviously we have non-functional requirements for things like performance, resilience and things like that. Do you ever come across much in the way of cost non-functional requirements? I mean, I've seen lots of things around, license cost expectations based on number of users because we're buying a big ERP system or something like that. But when it comes to Azure spend, do you see customers sort of making, things like, I expect this application to cost in this region as an actual requirement on the project?
I've never had anybody say to me, this is what it needs to cost me no more than in Azure. But in fairness, I think that might be because we start the conversation early anyway. So again, if we think about integrations, as part of our initial engagement, we're saying, well, how frequently are you exchanging information to find out how often this thing's going to run? How much data are we exchanging? Needs for things like security and that kind of stuff, because very early on in the process, as we're starting to get a feel for the application and what components might be involved, we're sleeves rolled up in the Azure price calculator, and we're saying to the customer, well, look, we think this is going to sort of cost this to run. And they'll go, okay. And then somebody will say, oh, hang on a minute, security. We've been told we have to put everything in a virtual network, Azure landing zones, best practice, whatever. We go, that's fine. But look, now your billing was this, now it's this. Because in order to get that model of security, we've had to move 3 tiers up the line in terms of the Azure services that we're using. So we've got a much higher cost without generating any more value, simply driven by security. And I think the one thing I try to do with customers is help them to understand where the costs are coming from. How much of the cost is actually, look, this is just the operating cost of the service itself. Logic App's consumption is a great example of that, right? Because it's how many times does it operate? But if you then say, okay, well, I need to move to a virtual network environment, well, immediately it's right. Well, instead of Logic App's consumption now, I have to use Logic App Standard, which means your minimum cost a month for that Logic App is now going to be 150 quid.
Yeah.
The more Logic Apps I can put into that hosting plan, the more I can throw value over them. So we end up drawing sort of graphs and charts fairly early on to help the customer understand where the cost comes from, because that will then help them work out how they either pass the cost on inside the organization or work out whether it's giving value, and figure out. It's that the age-old thing. Cloud's elastic, brilliant. We want this thing to scale. Do you really? Do we actually just want to cap the cost at a certain level, and the penance will be things are running more slowly, because we'll say where we don't want any more cost. We'll take the pain of slower throughput, because otherwise our billing is going to be, painfully high. There's always different axes, right? It's the age old. We used to have that triangle of you can have it on time or on budget, or it can be good quality. Pick any 2 of 3. I think cost is another axis on that operating cost is part of the things we ought to be looking at as we're designing the software, not just when we actually put it into production and go, crikey, that's expensive.
So I think you really touched on, actually, I made a note of another question while we were chatting there. So you touched exactly on that question about trade-offs, because I think in the well-architectured framework, there's actually some really good bits. If anybody watching hasn't read this, it's worth having a flick through, because it talks about trade-offs that you make in relation to costs of things like your trade-off security versus cost, or resilience versus cost and performance. And do you guys what are the most common cost trade-offs that you think you find in consultancy world?
Resilience is probably the one that happens most, because paranoia prevents people relaxing security. Now, having said that, I'm a firm believer in, and to be fair, this comes into resilience as well, right? It's right. What are the risks? What are we trying to defend against, be it security attack or data leakage or whatever, or downtime? What is the cost to the business if this goes wrong? And with resilience, it's always the same conversation. The customer says, well, this is cloud. We want 100% uptime. And I go, fantastic. That's probably starting at 7 zeros on the end of whatever bill we thought. I think, well, that's expensive. Well, yeah. Let's dial it back and think about what is the implication on the cost of what you think you need for reliability. And often what we find is good practices really help on this. If you've got a development team that have built good infrastructure as code and have good pipelines to deploy their application at the push of a button, that means if something happens, I can stand up the infrastructure pretty quickly with the cloud. So the question then becomes, where is my data? And the conversation about resilience and reliability and that kind of stuff is, Can you survive without the application? Yes, no. It's almost always yes. And then it's right. How long can you survive without the application? Because that tells us whether I simply have to back up your data and have a replica somewhere, and then I can deploy new infrastructure, or whether I need a cold standby, or whether I have to have a hot standby, or whether I'm actually doing active load balancing.
Yeah.
The great thing about the cloud is you can show people the impact on billing of their decisions. Because again, you put in the price calculator. Well, if you want this running both at the same time, we're going to have to use that SKU and that SKU and that SKU. And we got these extra components to do this. That's the bill. If this doesn't have to be running all the time, we can take those components out. That's the bill. If this doesn't have to be even deployed at the time, that's the bill.
How much do you feel? Obviously, they've been out a while now, but when availability zones came in, how much do you feel that impacted the resilience discussion with customers? Because obviously, a lot of the times people would have multi-data centers, maybe the front door with 2 app services and different data centers sitting behind it, and maybe a global Cosmos or something like that. But obviously, availability zone gives you that 3 nodes in region, which can simplify some of those architectures, and then you can DevOps deploy another region if you needed to. Do you think that's changed how people do stuff much, or do you think you still have that original way?
No, it's certainly changed the way we recommend customers do stuff. So, I mean, if you're looking at the microcosm of the world of Rik, then yes, it very much made a difference. But that's partly because I've had several conversations with people that I respect who work, within Microsoft, who say, look, realistically, our recommendation tends to be these days that zone redundancy is the right pitch for most customers, right? Because geo redundancy is quite expensive, and really, what is the chance of losing Slough? Much that we'd love to, we lose the whole of Slough. UK South is not necessarily going to stop. But potentially there could be a fire in one of the tin sheds in Slough. So zone redundancy is important. And in the olden days, when it was just availability sets, you didn't really know where your stuff was running. So there was a risk there that you couldn't mitigate unless you put it in another region. Whereas now you can consciously and actively mitigate risk by saying, I want zone redundancy. And zone redundancy is nowhere as expensive as geo redundancy. So what I find most of the time these days is we are architecting solutions that are zone redundant for the active components with a geo replication element for data. Because that's the one that I'm really paranoid about. If the worst happens, I want to make sure my data is somewhere else. And that then enables my disaster recovery scenario, which is I will deploy new infrastructure to UK West because UK South is dead, but my data's in UK West, so I'm fine. And the downtime there, yes, there's a cost to the business because it might take me a couple of hours to stand up new infrastructure, but that's way less bad than I'm paying for both all the time, right?
Yeah, especially if the likelihood's so small as well, isn't it? So that's it's quite interesting to hear you talk about that. Actually, it's something I've kind of thought about for quite a while, and it's good to hear that's the way you're thinking in the field. So next question, from a cost perspective, which types of resources on Azure do you like working with the most, and which do you find are the most difficult to work with? And I'll leave difficult to be whatever you think difficult means. It can either be in terms of configuration or explaining costs or whatever you come across.
I think that's so difficult. Usually in my world is the customer goes, "I'm sorry, how much?" And you probably have the same two as me as my bête noirs. Much as I love both of them and I love the teams. Service bus. Oh, I need a VNet. Right, service bus premium. Thank you. Ka-ching. And API management at the moment. VNet, API premium. Ka-ching. Now, certainly with the latter, the new standard V2 SKUs will make a big difference. But the reason I always call those two out is because I can't make it any cheaper. You can't scale it down.
Basic and enterprise and nothing in the middle kind of thing.
Exactly. And, I mean, in fairness, all of the product teams are really working hard now. I mean, I love that the standard V2 SKUs are. There's a lot of capability in there for things like VNet integration, but they're targeting the cost level that is like a third of the cost. And functions. I love functions. I hate functions premium because I've suddenly. I don't like functions premium if I'm doing it because I need the capacity, right? If I'm using them that much that I want the cold start time to be small, or I want to pack them, I need better scalability. But the stuff that they mentioned at Ignite, the new I've forgotten what it's called. The new premium, but not premium because it's consumption price.
Premium consumption, I think it was called, wasn't it?
Brilliant. The cloud should be about platform as a service, right? It's a phrase you coined and I use all the time. It's push fit plumbing. And I find it really frustrating that the cloud is still using a security model that's goes all the way back to when we used to do blooming thin Ethernet and T pieces and drag stuff around. It's all network based. Whereas there's got to be a better way, right? There's got to be a better way to plug things together and mitigate those security constraints. So I hate it when I get a service that's almost essential to me. It's ubiquitous. Service bus is one of those things. I can't remember the last time I built a cloud application that didn't have service busing, because virtually everything needs messaging. Either because we're trying to loosely couple the bits of our application, or because we're dealing with external organizations and we need to be able to scale in, scale out, whatever. Similarly, these days, API management is a de facto component because most organizations are trying to move to an API first model, where the applications they build are presenting APIs out for other applications to consume. So they're almost becoming like an essential part of the daily diet, but they're not priced that way. Not because MS are trying to price gouge, it's the way the architecture works and the limitations of it. But it's the stumbling block for most of my cloud conversations with customers. Because they go, oh crikey, that's expensive. I could do that on-prem for a lot less. And then we get into could you do it on-prem for a lot less? What capability are you sacrificing? And I think coming back to because this is a cost discussion, right? What cost benefit does capability give us? How do we judge that? How do we report on that? And I think that's one of the challenges that we've got as an industry is how we surface those potentially invisible costs, because you don't necessarily know what it might have been. I know that I can build you an integration in Logic Apps in days, and that can be in and working and ticking over and generating value for the business. On-prem, it might have taken me a month. But if we're not on-prem, it's very difficult for me I'm not going to run two side by side to show you, right? Did we bother to keep the data of how long it used to take us on-prem? Are we capturing the data of how long it takes us to do in the cloud? And I think the sharp organizations these days are the ones that are actually watching that. How many people does it take to do this? Not because I want to put them out of a job, but more because I need to know, do I need to scale my team? Is there a way we could work smarter? Are there things that I could do and maybe services I pay for that could help my team deliver solutions more quickly? So whilst I'm incurring cost, I'm actually shortening the time to generating revenue for the things that I'm doing.
So next question then, Rik. Do you have any interesting horror story maybe is the right word, but like any good stories or any cost optimizations that you've been really proud of that your team did that you think would be interesting?
So the horror story I always like to tell, because it actually sort of hammers home a few points all at once. We were working with a customer, and So it was an integration solution, and files came in via FTP because it's the service that will not die, right? But we didn't want to poll the FTP server, We wanted to do cool cloud stuff. So at the time, Event Grid was quite new, and there was a marketplace solution in Azure that was an FTP server running in a VM, but it would push to Azure storage. So an FTP file dropped in, it put a blob on Azure storage, and then Event Grid fired a trigger and called a logic app, which looked at the file to decide which external organization the file had come from and trigger one or more processing logic apps to route the file to its destination. Now, one Friday, because it's always a Friday, isn't it? Our customer was doing some work, and it's one of those, that FTP server's there already, I can use that because ultimately I'm going to want to do this to get stuff out to those organizations. And they were writing some DB scripts that did data extracts for the trading partners. And it ran through and did an extract for every customer and put the files on the FTP server. So the FTP server put the files on storage, which triggered an event. So the logic app fires, looks at the file, says that's nothing to do with us, and exits. But it's still done like two-step executions, right? Now, step execution on a logic app consumption is fraction of pence.
Yeah.
There's an error in the script. It doesn't tidy up. So the first time it runs, it drops out, let's say, 40 files for 40 trading partners. The second time it runs, it drops out another 40, but it hasn't removed the previous 40. The transfer to the FTP server just copies everything in the folder. The script runs every couple of minutes, and the person that wrote it went, yeah, that's fine, click, and left it running from about 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Now, we'd been good little bunnies, so we'd put cost alerts on the resource groups that our logic apps were in. And because this was costing virtually nothing, we got like a 200 quid cost alert threshold, right? So at about 11 o'clock on the Friday night, it passes the 200 quid threshold and emails go out. But my team don't support or operate this in production, so they're not looking at their emails, and it's the weekend. Unfortunately, the customers team aren't looking at their emails either. So the alarm's blaring and nobody's listening.
Yeah.
We come in at 8 o'clock on Monday morning to a lot of emails. Went, crikey, that's a bit. Went and had a look, cost report on the resource group, and over the weekend it had racked up about $4,000. Bearing in mind that it's a fraction of a pence per execution, right? But this thing's going on a logarithmic scale.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of things that I like to call out with that one. So one, there was a lot of good stuff there, right? We'd written cost alerts. We were worried. We'd set a reasonable threshold based on normal operating costs because we'd been watching it and adjusting that for a few weeks. So good. We'd got the constraint. We'd got the alert. It was a reasonable level. It wasn't like we'd set it crazy high. But nobody was listening to the alert. So nobody took any action because nobody really owned the thing itself. So that's problem number one. Problem number two was, why did this person decide to use a resource that wasn't really theirs, that was running for a project that wasn't theirs? It just happened to be sitting there, right? They went, we'll use that. So there's like an ownership.
All right. Oh, so the script that was putting files on wasn't anything to do with your integration?
Oh, no. No. It was the same trading partners. Therefore, why don't we use that FTP server that they put in over there? So we'd got no visibility of it. So there's a second point in there, which is, be careful about your communications between project teams and don't just go and use somebody else's car, right? Tell them you're going to borrow it.
Yeah.
But then there were things we could have done better. So we had an alert that went off and sent an email. But even back then, alerts could do other things. So we could have had it call a webhook or something. We might have been able to engineer it that if we passed the cost threshold, we could shut the logic app down, or at the very least turn the FTP server off. Because if trading partners can't send us files, they'll just queue up at their end. So we didn't think defensively about what to do in the event of the alarm firing. And we learned a lot from that. And we do think these days, well, what happens if it does, go wrong? But what we did do was we learned from the issues. So as soon as that thing happened, we said, well, how do we stop it happening again? And we looked at the solution, and we realized something else that I now bang into customers every time, which is when we built the thing, Event Grid did one thing. It worked a certain way, right? 6 months later, when the alert went off, it had new capabilities. And when we looked, we realized that we could take advantage of these new capabilities to prevent the issue happening again, because Event Grid introduced filters. So I could stop the event happening and being triggered if the file wasn't in the right place in the FTP server. So I effectively replaced the processing, the initial logic app I replaced with Event Grid filters. And the moral there, which is important to remember with cloud, is you're sitting on a moving escalator, and you've got to continually look at where you are. You've got to repeatedly look at the components you're using and see how they've changed, and see if you can improve the solution that you're building. And we think about that from the point of view of, oh, we want to make it better. There's this cool new feature that we can use and it'll help us be a better application. But actually, oftentimes the new features are, if we do that, it's cheaper. This new SKU allows us to go down a pricing tier, or this one allows us to, like flex consumption, right? I no longer need to run a premium consumption plan all the time. I can potentially use flex consumption when it comes out preview. And I'm back to, I get all the benefits, but I don't have the cost. And
yeah.
The thing that most organizations I encounter fail to do is cloud is for life, not just for Christmas, right? It's not like the olden days where we bought a server and it was in and running until we retired it 5 years later and nothing needed to change. Now, we should be monitoring and assessing our cloud solutions and changing them, because we can either improve capability, or we can improve the value to the business, or we can reduce the cost of the business because of the new stuff that's coming out. And organizations fail to do that because they think of it as that project's done and now we're on to the next one. It's in production and it's being operated by somebody else. Coming right back to that thing you were saying earlier, right, Mike, where it's to throw it over the wall. The dev team have done it. They've thrown it at production operations, and they're now running it, but they don't really know it and understand it. They don't know how they might optimize it or how they might change it. And they'd only think to come back to the dev team if there was a feature request or a bug. And the dev team are off looking at something else. And we forget about things. We move on to the next shiny, and we don't think about keeping an eye on our previous children. And I think there's a big learning in that for organisations in how you
run
chatting
with you is every time you answer a question, I'll write a note down of 3 more questions that I think I could ask you. And I'm just looking at that one. We're over 40 minutes now.
That's what editing's for, Mike.
Well, yeah. Do you know what? Right. So I would love to have you come back so we can talk about these other questions that I think would be really interesting. I've got two more questions I want to really ask you. So the first one.
Question in 2 parts, right?
No. So these are my kind of summary questions at the end that I'm going to try and ask every person we have on. So number 1, if people are visiting Bradford, which is where you guys are based, so Leeds, Bradford area, where's the place to go in your town if somebody's visiting and happens to be in your town or happens to be in a Black Marble event or something like that? I know there's a really good Azure user group in Leeds, so people will be in that area visiting.
So as you know, Bradford is the best place to get a curry in the UK. There's a real range from the Kashmir, which is one of the oldest curry houses and is very much the cheap but great, all the way up to the Mumtaz, which they sell their food in Harrods. My recommendation would actually be a curry house that was there when I was a lad at university and is still there now, and makes great food with great ingredients, and it's called the International, which is just by the university. They have another flagship restaurant now, but the one by the university is the one that's my favorite.
And so the next podcast we have, I'm not sure who the guest's going to be on that yet, but what question would you like asked of that person? Something to do with cost or Azure when we speak to whoever's the next guest on the podcast.
That's a really difficult one. Let's make it entertaining, right? What is the strangest request for a cloud delivered application that you've ever had?
Cool. Right, and so Rik, next time I speak to you on the podcast, the thing I want to really explore a bit further is this last kind of little story you told us there. I thought that was really fascinating because it's not just a cost thing, it's also kind of a security attack as well, even though it was an internal person who accidentally did something without realizing, they pulled the bottom brick out the Jenga block, not realizing it was the last one. And I think that, people don't think about cost-based security attacks. We always think about what happens if somebody hijacks or uses credentials, or if they gain access to your data. But actually, in your story there, if that was a small business, that £4,000 bill could have put them out of business. And I think people don't think about the security vulnerability associated with cost.
It's very true. I mean, it's something we talk about a lot with customers, Mike. So if we're building something that is cost per click, like logic apps or functions, our first question is, how are we going to protect this from somebody maliciously calling it from the outside world? Because even if they don't get into our system, they've still cost us money just by virtue of calling it and saying hello. And script kiddies these days can bring an awful lot of stuff to bear to make requests, and the platform will handle it because it'll scale. And it's something we never used to think about. So yeah, it's a good area of conversation.
Yeah, so that'll definitely be next time we chat. So just to wrap up, Rik, thank you very much for joining us today. This is one of our first episodes, so this will be out pretty soon. We hope everybody enjoyed today's conversation. Please let us know if people have any questions that we can follow up in future podcasts. Rik, do you have any suggestions on people you would like to see on the podcast? If there's anybody you think would have an interesting perspective on cost management on Azure that we should reach out to? Or people you kind of might notice their content related to.
So I mean, there's a lot of people that I respect when it comes to sort of Azure management and cost management. And there are people who I'd love to see on a podcast, just frankly, because I like watching them talk. So I think I'd be interested in hearing Sandro Pereira's thoughts, because he, like me, does a lot of integration. So it's a similar kind of camp, right? Other people that, if you don't already know, I can introduce you to. I think Magnus Martinsson, who's another organizer of Global Azure with me, he does a lot of work with large organizations outside the UK around sort of governance, cost management, that kind of stuff. And he's got a lot of insights. Similarly, another good friend of mine, a chap called Sakari Nahi, who works, he's got a company in Finland. He's been doing cloud for a very long time. And again, he's engaged at that sort of higher level, talking to CXOs, talking about the problems. I think cost is a game of two halves, right? A lot of people think of cost at the management level because that's where organizations think of it as. And a lot of my time is the CXO conversations. And there are a lot of great people in the Azure community who can have that conversation. But it's also a conversation that has to happen at the bottom as well. And that's not to say that Sandro's at the bottom, because he really isn't. But that kind of practitioner at the coalface, how do you think about cost when you're architecting your solutions? I think if you can get both sides of the
that's exactly our plan for the podcast, is to try and not just focus on one area, but get a good mix of that, because I think people need that rounded perspective to help them understand how to be in a good place, I think. So that's really in line with what we're thinking. So I'll just wrap the podcast up there. Rik, thank you again for joining us, and take care, everybody who's listening. Hope you have a great week, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks so much. Been a pleasure.